It had been some time now since the trio of warships had reluctantly parted ways with the rest of the convoy, effectively halving the number of escorts that had been protecting it. With each passing hour, the mood amongst the senior officers of the three destroyers had grown progressively darker as they ventured further out into the stormy seas. The same scene replicated on the bridge of each vessel, with the relevant instrumentation panels being closely regarded for any trace of the target they were pursuing. A mysterious radar contact, which had dogged the convoy for the last 48 hours, appearing for a few minutes at a time at the outer edge of the device's capabilities, only to then vanish as quickly as it materialized, leaving those observing it to speculate as to what manner of ship it could be, and why it was following in their wake. Passing traces of their quarry continued to materialize for a few seconds at a time, here and there, suggesting they were indeed on course to intercept it. But the fact that no clear reading was being returned remained a cause for concern, attributable at best to the poor weather conditions, and at worst to far fouler play. Accepting a cup of coffee from his steward, Isaac Sayers peered out through the rain-spattered windows of the bridge for any sign that the skies might be brightening, sure in his mind that the commanders of HMS Holt's two sister ships would be doing likewise, albeit free from the burden of responsibility bestowed upon him. He had not hesitated when the Commodore had designated him senior officer for this mission, despite his own private fears about a lack of operational experience. All being well, the target they were closing on would likely be some poor soul separated from another convoy, struggling to make its way through the same foul weather conditions. And if this were not the case, then hopefully the combined force of the three Royal Navy destroyers would be sufficient to ensure it posed no danger to the convoy they defended. It had been one of the lookouts aboard HMS Merrick, sailing off to the starboard side, who had first sighted the unexpected patch of sea fog that lay ahead of the trio. Sayers had cautiously ordered all three ships to increase the distance between them, advancing slowly to flank the outer edges of the anomalous weather formation. Now, having achieved their allocated positions, the Royal Navy destroyers rocked silently back and forth amidst the unsteady swell of the sea, awaiting further orders. Confirming that the signal they'd been tracking appeared to be emanating from within this bizarre manifestation, Sayers once again took up his binoculars, noting with interest the occasional flashes of deep indigo and purple that seemed to be running up and down the interior of the dark grey clouds that obscured the seas ahead. For several moments the young commander assessed the tactics and options available to him, running through various scenarios and consequences in his head, before dictating that orders be issued to the Merrick to move up closer to the anomaly, conducting further radar and visual sweeps of its interior, and that the commander of HMS Molyneux ensure his ship was ready to move up and render assistance were any further unexpected developments to occur. Confirming that replies had been received from the commanding officers of the other two ships, he then passed word for his own crew to prepare his vessel's defences, as keenly aware as they were that this would be the first time operationally they had done so, and could finally find themselves going into combat. With the strength of Germany's naval forces having been severely diminished in past years, attacks in strength upon Allied convoys had dropped significantly. But they were still not unheard of, and so the risk of the target they were now engaging, being an enemy vessel, should not be taken lightly. Satisfied he'd done all he could to safeguard his command against attack, Sayers had just settled back into his chair when there was a shout from one of the lookouts. A dark shape had now become visible, just inside the outer boundaries of the cloud formation ahead of them, one that was gradually growing in size and definition, and appeared to be heading directly towards the approaching HMS Merrick. Staring through his binoculars in anticipation, Sayers was astonished to see a battered sailing vessel now emerging from the dark haze into plain sight. His amazement growing as the individual features of the craft slowly became clear, resembling the sort of ship he had seen before on the pages of historical texts. The ship that was now sailing directly towards HMS Merrick was a three-masted galleon, directly out of an era that long predated that of the three awaiting warships. Sayers could do little other than watch on, in a mixture of apprehension and amazement, as the Merrick began to turn sharply to starboard, to avoid the coming collision. He could only imagine the harsh language being used by the destroyer's captain, Keith Lambert, to successfully achieve this manoeuvre. Several figures materialising from within the Merrick's wheelhouse, gesturing directly at the mysterious sailing ship that was now sailing past them. Turning his attention away from the Holt's sister ship and back to the newcomer, Sayers took in the sorry state of the galleon. The masts were a mess of swinging ropes and torn fabric, with her hull clearly displaying several gaping and splintered holes from an unknown conflict. And there, hanging listlessly from the rear of her quarterdeck, was a solitary flag, bearing the Red Cross of St. George. Keenly aware of the excitable chatter that was taking place on the bridge around him, and the lack of purpose, Sayers turned to make his way across to where the radio operator sat, only to be stopped in his tracks by a chorus of surprised gasps and exclamations from the men who were still staring out of the bridge window, as a second dark shape now followed the beleaguered galleon out into daylight, from within the dark and purple, rolling clouds. In stark contrast to the first ship which had materialised from inside the anomaly, this second vessel presented as in pristine condition. It was much larger than the first, bearing none of the visible damage sustained by its predecessor, and flying a far different flag, that of a ragged vertical cross, set along a yellow vivid background, visible at several posts being flown from its hull. Staring impotently through his binoculars, Sayers observed the reactions of the men standing outside the bridge of the Merrick, one of whom was undoubtedly Captain Lambert, urging his men to re-enter the bridge in order to resume their appointed stations. But it was already too late, as a series of violent eruptions suddenly sprang forth from the side of the passing galleon. Several seconds later, the sharp and deafening crack of artillery fire came floating across the waves towards the other two destroyers, its sudden and unexpected chorus snapping Sayers violently out of his stupor, prompting him to yell out a series of orders. Commands that had already been preempted by the crew of HMS Molyneux, whose guns swiveled to cover the attacker at the exact same time. The subsequent volley from her 4-inch turrets, ripping and tearing through the wooden hull of the galleon, triggering a series of horrific internal explosions that removed any trace of the vessel from the face of the earth, before the gun crews then turned their attention to the other mysterious sailing ship, as the mournful shape of HMS Merrick lay stationary in the water, not far from where they were travelling. Roughly an hour later, the damaged galleon floated up alongside HMS Holt, its crew having been removed, and a small party from the destroyer now assessing its condition. Several hundred metres away, HMS Molyneux lay alongside the wounded Merrick, with members of both crews enacting what repairs they could. It was with a heavy heart and stern features that Leonard Tobin, the Molyneux's captain, later stepped into the mess hall of HMS Holt to meet with Sayers. Accompanied by the senior members of his staff, and bearing close to the worst possible news about their damaged sister ship. Captain Lambert had been killed, along with the majority of the Merrick's bridge crew, with little to protect them from the broadside of the Phantom sailing vessel. The same volley had shredded the lightly armoured bridge of the Tribal-class destroyer, leaving her with only manual firing control and limited manoeuvring. His report delivered, and a stiff drink accepted in reply, it was then the turn of Tobin and his men to listen to the report of their companions in relation to the captured galleon. The occupants of the damaged vessel had managed to convey to their captors their ship was named the Minion, one of 6 that originally set sail from England. They had travelled across the Atlantic to the other side of the world, where they had been surprised by a superior enemy force and attacked. With the bulk of their force destroyed, only 2 ships had escaped, which were still being remorselessly pursued by their attackers when the skies around them had darkened, only to then find the 3 Royal Navy destroyers awaiting them when they'd emerged from inside the passing storm they had encountered. But most bizarrely, the 15 surviving members of the Minion's crew believed it to be the year 1568, and that those who had attacked them were emissaries of the Holy Spanish Empire, locked in a perpetual state of conflict with the English crown, all of which had been conveyed in a broken form of English language by their captain, a heartbroken and dejected man by the name of John Hawkins. With the exception only of some of the younger assembled officers, the unexpected reference to this name produced a series of oaths from those present. as if what they were enduring were not fantastic enough. The involvement of one of the founding fathers of the Royal Navy was proving impossible to digest. Correctly evaluating the thoughts and feelings of his audience, Sayers pressed on, keen to avoid this discussion becoming derailed by any of the bewildered participants. Hawkins and his men had been desperately trying to return to England, having been bested and pursued by a force of 5 Spanish galleons. Although one was now removed from the equation thanks to their efforts, it was reason to believe that the remaining 4 still lurked beyond the storm. Assuming there was truth to what the man claiming to be Hawkins said, this placed the destroyer commanders in an impossible predicament. Were John Hawkins not to return from the future he had mysteriously found himself in, he might also not be able to found his country's navy. Indeed, with him and his lieutenants absent from the later occasion of the Spanish Armada, it could prove his country would cease to exist altogether, which in turn may mean the destroyers and their crews might not come to be, with history changed irreparably as a result. In a similar vein, were Hawkins to return to his own time and be slain by his pursuers, the same set of outcomes could still occur. It seemed the only viable way of resolving the matter would be for some element of the Naval Task Force to accompany Hawkins back to the past and ensure his safety, potentially also losing their ability to return home in the process, and trying to ensure they too did not influence history for the worse. As the enormity of Sayers' observations worked their way around the room, none of the men present could find any reply to offer. For the next 5 minutes, the only sounds to be heard were the shuffling of feet, or the sound of a bottle or glass being placed back down onto a table. When a voice finally spoke, it proved to be neither Sayers nor Tobin, but instead to be the only surviving officer of the beleaguered HMS Merrick. Wincing from a minor injury sustained to his right leg, as he rose unsteadily from his chair, Peter Tipton spoke in shaky and uncertain tones, explaining how he and the remaining members of his crew owed it to their slain captain to salvage some form of victory from this defeat. The Merrick would likely not make it back to the convoy in any degree of high seas, but could still prove able to cover the Minion's retreat. Pausing to assess the fear and the determination in the gaze of his junior officer, Sayers found it hard to fault the man's argument. Giving orders the Merrick be ready for combat in the next half hour, he then sent for Hawkins to attend the mess hall, explaining sternly and patiently how vital it was that Hawkins make it home, and the full sacrifice that the crew of the Merrick would be making to achieve this. The price of this service being a share for each of HMS Merrick's surviving crew members of the treasures that lay down in the hold of the Minion. Both captains agreeing on this bargain before parting to ready their ships for departure, back through the fading storm that lay before them, into a past and a future that neither of them were able to predict. Peering out down the length of the telescope he held, the commanding officer of the San Salvador felt himself consumed by a sense of apprehension. Captain Ramon Delgadillo's orders from the Lieutenant Governor of Veracruz had been simple enough: pursue and destroy the 2 English vessels that had somehow managed to escape the harbour ambush which destroyed their compatriots. When the slower of the pair had been sighted, attempting to lose its pursuers amidst an approaching weather front, this task had seemed easy enough. And yet the warship he'd sent into the storm after their crippled prey had yet to return, despite no reason why it should fail in its mission. Delgadillo was still mulling over the prospect of sending a second galleon in search of its sister ship, when a bell began to sound from the deck below. Something was moving in the purplish haze that lay ahead, growing and unfolding, until its lines gradually became recognisable as their English quarry. Pushing to the back of his mind the concerns over his missing vessel, the Spanish captain issued orders for his flotilla of ships to engage the enemy. But it had been midway through this process. The clatter of the bell sounding below him became more intense, and was joined by a series of wild cries. Again lifting his spyglass, Delgadillo saw a second shape emerging from the haze, alongside the English transport, one that was not the galleon he'd previously dispatched. A craft unlike any other he'd seen before, lacking sails or topmasts, constructed entirely from steel rather than wood. One that was now heading directly towards the waiting Spanish vessels, whilst their target came about and began to pull away. As Degadillo's orders began to be translated to the other 3 galleons under his command, the distance between the warships began to widen significantly, their individual crews readying cannon and boarding parties, moving to surround the mysterious incoming vessel. Standing amidst the shattered remains of what had once been the bridge of HMS Merrick, Peter Tipton watched as the Spanish galleons moved out to flank his destroyer. As he did so, he found himself wondering if any Royal Navy commander had ever found themselves in a less envious position to commence a battle. He had no direct contact to any of the ship's 4-inch gun turrets, of which only 3 were suitably manned by what remained of his crew. Orders to them would need to be physically relayed along the centre of the ship, the same process allowing communication with the engine room for steering control. It was clear from the movements of the Spanish ships that 3 of their number intended to engage him, the larger of the 4, presumably their flagship, instead moving astern, apparently in pursuit of the Minion and its crew. Sending word to the engine room to reverse course, he then gave orders for the Merrick's gun crews to engage each of the galleons in turn, starting with the closest. Shortly after, the Tribal-class destroyer began to shake and reverberate as Tipton's orders arrived at each of the 3 working turrets. Almost immediately, the nearest side of an approaching Spanish ship disintegrated like matchwood as the British shells hit home, a string of small explosions detonating up and down the length of the vessel before its entire hull erupted outwards in a fiery inferno. As it did so, the cannon of the other 2 approaching galleons opened up, peppering the destroyer's hull. Although most of the incoming projectiles bounced harmlessly off the ship's armour, hits were sustained upon the more vulnerable upper sections. Here and there, men screamed in agony as they were caught out in the open, or hit by splinters impacting in through doors or passageways. Undeterred, Tipton continued to pass orders back down the main corridor of his command, urging his gunners onwards to select the next nearest target, conscious as he did so that the Spanish flagship had now passed them by and was following the Minion, and the other 2 enemy galleons were drawing ever closer to his own ship. Delgadillo stared intently as his 2nd galleon was rapidly turned into kindling by the bizarre-looking warship, its wreckage sinking beneath the waves. At great cost, though, it had brought its surviving sister ship the time needed to pull directly alongside their opponent and land boarding parties. To his dismay, he now saw figures in dark uniforms emerge up onto the deck of the strange craft, quick-firing carbines they held felling scores of his men. But by sheer weight of numbers, the Spanish sailors were still pressing forwards, using their own firearms and blades to fell their opponents. In doing so, buying the further time that he and the crew of the San Salvador needed to gain ground on the fleeing British transport, and to send it directly to the ocean floor, joining the men he had already sacrificed in order to achieve this goal. Trying to divorce himself from the sounds of the wounded and dying that echoed along the ship's corridors, Tipton watched as the Spanish flagship continued to pull away. Unholstering his pistol, he grabbed hold of the nearest crewman, dispatching the sailor down to the engine room with orders to increase their speed as much as possible. Pausing to lean against a bulkhead as the pain in his injured leg increased, Tipton was shocked to see 2 ragged figures advancing down the ship's main corridor, both covered in black powder and bloodstains, wielding vicious-looking bladed weapons as they advanced upon him. As the pair broke into a run, raising their weapons, Tipton emptied the contents of the pistol's magazine into them, falling backwards as he did so. Then one of the sailors acting as a runner was by his side, helping the injured captain back up to his feet. The 2 men slowly made their way along the ship to the nearest set of 4-inch guns, stepping over the bodies of English and Spanish sailors as they did so. Upon reaching the turret, Tipton ordered the crew there to abandon the weapon, and instead to make their way to the engine room to guard from any attack. And as the ship shook violently itself again, from a further broadside directly into the heart of the galleon alongside it, Peter Tipton willed his injured body forwards, making for the 2 remaining turrets in an effort to ensure that their final opponent could not reach the Minion, or its famous commander. Standing on the quarterdeck of his own ship, John Hawkins watched on in wonder as the incredible battle played out just a few hundred metres away from him. He had long accepted he had no ability to defend himself, lacking the crew or the powder to use the Minion's guns. The only hope of survival for him and the few men alive under his command were the steel beast now locked in battle with the Spanish, a terrifying weapon, which had already destroyed 3/4 of its enemy and was now overhauling its final opponent. All at once, the San Salvador began to turn, bringing its guns fully to bear upon Hawkins and his vessel, the Spanish captain having likely realised he could not outstrip his pursuer, and perhaps hoping that a lucky shot could still fulfil his mission. But before the mighty galleon could fire, the metal beast that followed had already impacted him forcefully into its side. There was a brief pause, and then a huge explosion of smoke and flame as the guns of the English vessel spoke again. When this cleared, several minutes later, only one ship remained. Of the San Salvador, there was no trace. But the ship from the future had clearly not survived the battle, and was beginning to settle down into the waves. Lifting his spyglass, Hawkins observed a small throng of figures hurriedly abandoning the dying ship, and then he ordered his own crew to bring the Minion to a halt and to launch their boats, in order to fulfill his half of the deal he had made with these men from the future. Assembling the survivors of HMS Merrick at the rear of the Minion, Peter Tipton explained in full the bargain made for their futures and for their families. Each would be provided with a share of gold, which they would be able to invest, so that it would be worth a small fortune when eventually claimed by their forebears in the present day. But the price of this would be to cast off any item or memory associated with that future, instead living a mundane and Spartan existence that could not impact upon the rest of English society, because to do so, to alter their future in any way or form, could mean that not one of them might end up being born. Turning to where Hawkins stood waiting, Tipton raised a hand to indicate for his men to accompany the captain down into the hold to select their rewards, reaching down into his coat pocket with the other hand and running his fingers across the revolver and the grenade that he had secreted there, the two items he had made the deliberate decision not to cast overboard, as he had overseen and observed his men doing exactly what he had ordered, as these items held the potential not only to enrich the future of the British Isles, but also his own.